What if the person you trusted most was systematically erasing everyone who ever loved you? Before we dive into one of the most chilling cases in Pacific Northwest history, leave a comment below and tell us from where you are watching. Have you ever felt like someone was watching you even in your own home? Keep that feeling in mind, because today's story will make you question everything you thought you knew about trust, family, and the darkness that can hide behind the most innocent smile. It's the spring of 1962 in the dense, rain-soaked forests of Washington State, where the Olympic Mountains cast long shadows over small logging towns that seem frozen in time. This is a place where neighbors know each other's business, where secrets are hard to keep, and where one name would eventually become synonymous with a terror so methodical, so calculated, that even seasoned investigators would struggle to comprehend its scope. That name was Eleanor Vance. Eleanor was 28 years old when her story first intersected with the official record, though as we'll discover, her dark work had begun years earlier. She wasn't the kind of woman who commanded attention when she walked into a room. She was quiet, almost mousy, with plain brown hair always pulled back in a simple ponytail, and wire-rimmed glasses that made her look more like a librarian than anything sinister. She wore modest dresses in muted colors, spoke softly, and had a habit of averting her eyes when directly addressed. Everything about Eleanor Vance screamed ordinary, forgettable, harmless. But beneath that unremarkable exterior lived something far more disturbing than anyone in the small town of Forks, Washington, could have imagined. Eleanor had come to Forks in 1959, arriving on a Greyhound bus with a single worn suitcase and a story about escaping an abusive marriage in California. The story was vague, deliberately so, with just enough detail to discourage further questions while eliciting sympathy from the tight-knit community. The women of Forks, particularly those involved with the local Baptist church, took Eleanor under their collective wing. They helped her find a small apartment above the hardware store on Main Street, secured her a job as a nurse's aide at the county medical clinic, and welcomed her into their social circles with the kind of warmth small towns are known for. Eleanor seemed grateful, almost overwhelmed by the kindness. She attended church every Sunday without fail, volunteered at community events, and was always ready to help neighbors in need. When old Mrs. Patterson fell ill with pneumonia, Eleanor spent 3 nights sitting at her bedside, monitoring her breathing and administering medication. When the Hendersons' youngest child broke his arm, Eleanor was there at the clinic, gently distracting the boy with stories while the doctor set the bone. She became known as someone you could count on, someone who showed up when others didn't, someone who cared. But there was something else about Eleanor that people noticed, though few could articulate exactly what made them uneasy. She had a peculiar way of inserting herself into people's lives during their most vulnerable moments. She gravitated toward the sick, the elderly, the isolated. She would appear at the hospital or someone's home with offers of help that seemed almost too eager, too perfectly timed. And once Eleanor was in your life, once she had established herself as indispensable, she was nearly impossible to remove. Her first known victim, though no one realized it at the time, was a 67-year-old widower named Harold Finch. Harold lived alone in a modest house at the edge of town, surrounded by towering Douglas firs that blocked most of the sunlight even on the brightest days. His wife had died 2 years earlier, and his only daughter lived in Seattle, visiting perhaps once every few months. Harold was the perfect target, isolated, lonely, and suffering from mild dementia that was gradually worsening. He had difficulty remembering names, often confused present events with memories from decades past, and was becoming increasingly dependent on others for basic daily tasks. Eleanor met Harold at the medical clinic where she worked. He had come in complaining of persistent headaches and dizziness. The doctor, an overworked man in his 60s named Marcus Webb, examined Harold briefly, attributed the symptoms to age and stress, and prescribed some mild pain medication. Eleanor, who had assisted during the examination, offered to check on Harold at home to ensure he was taking his medication properly and managing his symptoms. The doctor, grateful for the help, readily agreed. What began as simple wellness checks quickly evolved into something more involved. Eleanor started visiting Harold daily, bringing him meals, organizing his medications, helping with household chores he could no longer manage effectively. She became his lifeline to the outside world, the one person he saw regularly, the one person he relied on completely. Harold's daughter, Catherine, was initially relieved that someone was looking after her father. During her infrequent visits, she thanked Eleanor profusely, even offered to pay her for the extra care. Eleanor refused payment with characteristic modesty, insisting she was simply being neighborly. But Eleanor was doing more than being neighborly. She was isolating Harold systematically and deliberately. When Catherine called to speak with her father, Eleanor would often answer, explaining that Harold was sleeping or confused and couldn't come to the phone. She suggested, always gently, that Catherine's calls seemed to agitate Harold, that perhaps less frequent contact would be better for his mental state. When Harold's few friends from church tried to visit, Eleanor would intercept them at the door, explaining that Harold wasn't feeling well, that he needed rest, that too many visitors overwhelmed him. Gradually, the calls stopped. The visits ceased. Harold's world contracted until Eleanor was the only person in it. 6 months after Eleanor began caring for Harold, he died suddenly at home. Eleanor found him, or so she claimed, collapsed in his bedroom early one morning. She called the clinic in tears, and Dr. Webb came immediately. Harold's body was already cold, indicating he had died hours earlier, probably during the night. Given his age, his dementia, and his general declining health, Dr. Webb saw no reason to suspect anything unusual. He signed the death certificate, listing the cause as cardiac arrest, a common enough ending for a man of Harold's age and condition. Harold's daughter Catherine arrived from Seattle for the funeral, devastated by the loss and consumed by guilt that she hadn't been there more often. Eleanor, ever helpful, had already made most of the arrangements. She had contacted the funeral home, notified Harold's few remaining friends, and even selected a casket, all before Catherine arrived. Throughout the service and burial, Eleanor remained at Catherine's side, offering tissues, gentle touches on the arm, murmured condolences. She was the picture of compassionate support. What no one knew, what wouldn't be discovered until much later, was that Harold hadn't died of natural causes. Eleanor had been systematically poisoning him for weeks with digoxin, a heart medication she had easy access to at the clinic. In small, carefully measured doses, digoxin is therapeutic. In larger amounts, or when given to someone not prescribed the medication, it causes cardiac arrhythmias that can be fatal, especially in elderly patients with compromised health. The symptoms mimic natural heart failure so closely that unless someone is specifically looking for toxicology evidence, the poisoning goes completely undetected. Harold had been Eleanor's test case, her proof of concept, and it had worked perfectly. 2 months after Harold's death, Eleanor attended his estate settlement. Harold had left a will, drafted years earlier, that divided his modest assets between his daughter and several charities. But there was also a codicil, a recent addition dated just 3 weeks before Harold's death, leaving $5,000 to Eleanor Vance in recognition of her extraordinary kindness and care during his final months. The document appeared to be in Harold's handwriting, though shaky and uncertain. His signature was witnessed by 2 people Eleanor knew from church, neither of whom thought twice about signing when Eleanor asked them to do her a favor. Catherine was surprised by the bequest, but not suspicious. $5,000 seemed reasonable, even generous, given how much Eleanor had done. She thanked Eleanor again, embraced her at the lawyer's office, and told her she deserved every penny. Eleanor accepted with characteristic humility, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue as if overwhelmed by the gesture. $5,000 in 1960 was substantial money in a small logging town. Eleanor used part of it to purchase a small house on Maple Street, a tidy bungalow with a front porch and a small garden. She told neighbors she had received an inheritance from a distant relative. No one questioned it. Why would they? Eleanor was trustworthy, reliable, beyond suspicion. But Eleanor wasn't satisfied. $5,000 wouldn't last forever, and she had discovered something about herself during those months caring for Harold. She had discovered that she enjoyed it. Not the caregiving itself, but the control, the power of holding someone's life in her hands, the godlike authority to decide who lived and who died. It gave her a rush that nothing else in her quiet, ordinary life had ever provided. She began looking for her next victim. His name was Thomas Bridger, a 58-year-old bachelor who worked as a bookkeeper for the local lumber mill. Thomas had never married, had no close family, and lived in a small apartment above the post office. He was quiet, kept to himself mostly, and his only real social outlet was the weekly poker game he hosted for 3 other mill workers. Thomas had recently been diagnosed with diabetes, a condition that required careful monitoring and insulin injections. He was still learning to manage properly. Eleanor heard about Thomas's diagnosis through the clinic gossip network. She engineered a meeting at the post office, striking up a conversation about how challenging diabetes management could be, mentioning that she had extensive experience with diabetic patients at the clinic. Thomas, who was struggling with the dietary restrictions and medication schedule, was grateful for the advice. Eleanor offered to help him organize his insulin routine, to teach him proper injection technique, to monitor his blood sugar levels until he felt more confident managing on his own. Just like with Harold, what began as simple assistance quickly became complete dependence. Thomas daily, administering his insulin, preparing his meals according to his dietary needs, keeping meticulous records of his blood sugar readings. Thomas, who had always been independent, found himself actually enjoying having someone care for him. Eleanor was patient, never judgmental about his occasional lapses in discipline, always encouraging. She began staying longer during her visits, chatting about his work at the mill, his past, his regrets about never marrying or having children. Thomas found himself confiding in Eleanor in ways he had never confided in anyone. Eleanor was particularly interested in Thomas's finances. She learned, through carefully casual questions, that Thomas had been a frugal man his entire life, saving a substantial portion of his salary for decades. He owned his apartment building outright, purchased years earlier as an investment, and had significant savings at the local bank. He had no will, no beneficiaries designated, no estate plan whatsoever. When Eleanor gently suggested he should probably organize his affairs given his diabetes diagnosis, Thomas agreed. Eleanor recommended a lawyer she knew. Actually, the same lawyer who had handled Harold's estate, and offered to help Thomas think through how he wanted to distribute his assets. The poker games stopped. Eleanor suggested they weren't good for Thomas's stress levels or blood sugar control. Thomas's work friends tried to visit a few times, but Eleanor was always there, always with a reason why it wasn't a good time. Gradually, Thomas's world contracted around Eleanor, just as Harold's had before him. 8 months after Eleanor began caring for Thomas, he died of what appeared to be severe hypoglycemia, a diabetic coma caused by blood sugar dropping dangerously low. Eleanor found him unresponsive in his apartment and called for emergency help, but it was too late. Dr. Turnow. Webb, who had treated Thomas's diabetes, was saddened but not surprised. Diabetes was a difficult disease to manage, especially for someone living alone. Sometimes patients miscalculated their insulin doses or didn't eat enough to balance their medication. It was tragic, but it happened. What Dr. Webb didn't know was that Eleanor had been deliberately giving Thomas excessive insulin, carefully timing the doses to create increasingly severe hypoglycemic episodes that she would then rescue him from, building his dependence on her while simultaneously damaging his organs with the repeated stress. The final dose, administered while Thomas slept, was massive enough to ensure he would never wake up. Thomas's will, drafted just 2 months before his death, left his entire estate to Eleanor Vance. The apartment building, his life savings, everything. The document cited her extraordinary care during his illness and his wish that she be rewarded for her selfless dedication. There were no other beneficiaries, no one to contest the will, no one to question why a relative stranger had inherited everything from a man she had known less than a year. The lawyer who had drafted both Harold's codicil and Thomas's will, a man named Vernon Ashby, found it slightly unusual that Eleanor had been named in 2 separate estates within months of each other. But unusual wasn't illegal, and both documents had been properly executed with witnesses present. Ashby filed the probate paperwork and moved on to other matters. Eleanor now owned property and had assets exceeding $30,000, a small fortune in early 1960s Forks, Washington. She quit her job at the clinic, claiming she needed time to process her grief over Thomas's death and wanted to focus on managing the rental property she had inherited. Webb and the clinic staff expressed their condolences and wished her well. No one suspected anything except perhaps Vernon Ashby, whose unease was purely intuitive and unsupported by any evidence. But Eleanor wasn't finished. She had perfected her method now, understood the patterns and rhythms of manipulation required to isolate a victim completely before administering the fatal dose of whatever poison best suited their medical condition. She had learned to forge handwriting convincingly, to manipulate witnesses into signing documents without reading them carefully, to present herself as the grieving caregiver while concealing the predator beneath. Her third victim was different from the first 2. Margaret Chen was only 45 years old, a widow whose husband had died in a logging accident 3 years earlier. Margaret had 2 teenage sons and owned a successful small restaurant on Main. She was well known in the community, had many friends, and was generally healthy. She should have been the worst possible target for someone like Eleanor. But Margaret had one vulnerability that Eleanor identified and exploited ruthlessly. She was desperately lonely. Margaret's husband had been her high school sweetheart, the only man she had ever loved. His death had devastated her, leaving her to raise two boys alone while managing a demanding business. She threw herself into work and parenting, leaving no time for grief or personal needs. Her friends worried about her, urged her to start dating again, but Margaret insisted she was fine, that she had no interest in another relationship, that her sons and restaurant were enough. Eleanor met Margaret at church, where they both volunteered for the women's auxiliary. Eleanor began sitting next to Margaret during services, joining her for coffee afterward, listening sympathetically when Margaret occasionally opened up about how hard things had been since her husband's death. Eleanor never pushed, never pried, just listened with quiet empathy that gradually earned Margaret's trust. Unlike with Harold and Thomas, Eleanor's approach with Margaret was more psychological than medical. She didn't need to establish herself as a caregiver because Margaret wasn't sick. Instead, Eleanor positioned herself as Margaret's closest confidant, the one person who truly understood her pain, who never judged her for still grieving years after her husband's death, who validated her feelings when everyone else seemed to expect her to move on. Eleanor began spending more time at Margaret's house, helping with household chores, cooking meals when Margaret was too tired after long days at the restaurant. She bonded with Margaret's sons, helping them with homework, attending their school events when Margaret couldn't get away from work. She made herself indispensable, not through medical care, but through emotional support and practical help that Margaret desperately needed but hadn't wanted to ask for. But Eleanor was also doing something more insidious. She was slowly, systematically driving wedges between Margaret and everyone else in her life. She would mention in passing that she had overheard Margaret's friends gossiping about her, nothing specific, just enough to plant seeds of doubt. She would suggest that Margaret's sons seemed resentful of how much time she spent at the restaurant, that perhaps they blamed her for their father's death even though it wasn't rational. She would interpret innocent comments from church members as judgment, turning every interaction into evidence that people didn't really care about Margaret the way Eleanor did. Margaret's world began to shrink. She stopped attending auxiliary meetings, claiming she was too busy. She became distant with her longtime friends, convinced they were talking behind her back. She relied more and more on Eleanor, who was always there, always supportive, always ready to help. Even Margaret's sons noticed something was off, tried to tell their mother that Eleanor seemed to be isolating her, but Margaret dismissed their concerns. They were teenagers. They didn't understand adult friendships. They were probably just jealous of the attention Margaret gave to Eleanor. Then Eleanor began suggesting that Margaret seemed depressed, that perhaps she should see a doctor about getting medication. Margaret initially resisted, but Eleanor was persistent, gentle but firm. She mentioned articles she had read about depression, shared stories of people whose lives had improved dramatically with the right medication. Eventually, Margaret agreed to see Dr. Webb, who prescribed a mild antidepressant after a brief consultation. Eleanor volunteered to pick up the prescription and help Margaret remember to take it daily. She even organized Margaret's other medications, vitamins and supplements Margaret took for general health. What Eleanor didn't tell Margaret was that she was also adding other pills to the daily regimen, sedatives stolen from the clinic before she left, gradually increasing doses that made Margaret increasingly foggy, forgetful, and dependent. The changes were subtle at first. Margaret would forget conversations, lose track of time, struggle to focus on restaurant operations. She chalked it up to stress and depression, never suspecting the medications Eleanor was giving her were causing the problems. The restaurant began suffering. Margaret made mistakes with orders, forgot to pay suppliers, missed important meetings with her accountant. Her sons were terrified, watching their mother deteriorate in front of them, but unable to get her to listen when they suggested Eleanor might be the problem. It was Margaret's eldest son, David, who finally took action. He was 17, preparing for college, and smart enough to realize something was very wrong. He started documenting his mother's decline, taking photos of the medications Eleanor was administering, writing down times and dates. He took his evidence to Vernon Ashby, the lawyer who had handled his father's estate, and explained his concerns. Ashby, who already harbored suspicions about Eleanor from the Finch and Bridger estates, took David seriously. He contacted Sheriff Raymond Howell, a no-nonsense lawman who had been with the department for 20 years. Howell listened to David's story, reviewed the documentation, and felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He had heard the gossip about Eleanor inheriting from two different men within months of each other, but he had dismissed it as small-town rumor-mongering. Now, looking at David's carefully compiled evidence, he wondered if there was something more sinister at play. Howell began a discreet investigation. He pulled the death certificates for Harold Finch and Thomas Bridger, noting that both had been signed by Dr. Webb with causes of death listed as natural given their age and medical conditions. He obtained copies of their wills and codicils, noting that Eleanor Vance was the primary beneficiary in both cases. He interviewed neighbors, church members, anyone who had known the deceased men and had interacted with Eleanor. A disturbing pattern emerged. Multiple people mentioned how Eleanor had isolated both men in their final months, how she had discouraged visitors, how she had been the only person with consistent access to them before their deaths. Several people mentioned feeling uneasy about Eleanor, though they couldn't articulate why. Times, but Eleanor always had an excuse why it wasn't a good time, and eventually he gave up trying. Howell contacted the Washington State Police, requesting assistance from the Criminal Investigation Division. A detective named Sarah Morse was assigned to the case. Morse was a rarity in 1962, a female detective in a male-dominated field, and she had earned her position through exceptional investigative skills and a dogged refusal to let cases go unsolved. She reviewed Howell's preliminary findings and immediately recognized the hallmarks of a serial killer, though that term wasn't commonly used yet in American law enforcement. Morse's first priority was preventing Eleanor from harming Margaret Chen. She obtained a court order requiring Dr. Webb to perform a full medical evaluation of Margaret, including comprehensive toxicology screening. When the results came back, they were shocking. Margaret's system was flooded with sedatives at levels far exceeding any legitimate medical purpose. She was being systematically drugged, her cognitive decline entirely artificial and potentially reversible if the medications were stopped. Armed with this evidence, Sheriff Howell arrested Eleanor Vance on charges of attempted murder, assault, and fraud. The arrest took place at Margaret's house, where Eleanor was preparing Margaret's daily medications. When officers entered, they found Eleanor crushing pills and mixing them into applesauce, her method of administration designed to prevent Margaret from identifying what she was actually taking. Eleanor's reaction to the arrest was chilling. She didn't protest her innocence, didn't demand to know what this was about, didn't show any of the outrage an innocent person would display. Instead, she simply looked at Sheriff Howell with those quiet eyes behind her wire-rimmed glasses and said calmly, "I was helping her. She needed me." A search of Eleanor's house revealed a horrifying collection of evidence. Notebooks filled with detailed records of her victims, medication schedules, dosage calculations, notations about their responses to different drugs, forged documents in various stages of completion, reference books on toxicology, pharmacology, and estate law. And most disturbing, a list of names, 15 names in total, with 3 of them crossed off and labeled with dates: Harold Finch, Thomas Bridger, and a third name that made investigators' blood run cold: Robert Vance. Robert Vance was supposedly Eleanor's ex-husband, the abusive man she had fled from in California. Except there was no record of Robert Vance ever existing. Detective Morse contacted California authorities and discovered that Eleanor's entire backstory was fabricated. Her real name was Eleanor Sutton, and she had been suspected but never charged in the death of an elderly woman she had cared for in San Francisco in 1958. That investigation had stalled due to lack of evidence, and Eleanor had simply moved on to Washington State to start fresh. The forensic investigation expanded to include exhumation orders for Harold Finch and Thomas Bridger. Though their bodies had been buried for months, modern toxicology testing might still detect certain poisons. Both exhumations revealed traces of the medications Eleanor had used. Harold's remains showed elevated digoxin levels incompatible with natural heart failure. Thomas's body contained evidence of insulin levels far exceeding what any diabetic would naturally have, even in cases of accidental overdose. As the investigation deepened, Detective Morse began checking those other 12 names on Eleanor's list. 6 of them were people living in Forks, elderly or isolated individuals who had some form of wealth. The remaining 6 were names from various small towns across Oregon and Northern California going back nearly 10 years. Morse contacted law enforcement in those jurisdictions and discovered a horrifying pattern. In every location, there had been an elderly person who died of apparently natural causes while being cared for by a quiet, helpful woman matching Eleanor's description. In every case, that woman had inherited money or property. In every case, she had disappeared shortly after the probate was settled, moving on to a new town, sometimes a new state, always leaving before anyone became suspicious. Eleanor Sutton, or Eleanor Vance, or whatever her real name was, had been killing for a decade, refining her methods, learning from each victim how to better manipulate her next one. Harold Finch and Thomas Bridger weren't her first victims. They were probably her 8th and 9th. The trial began in September 1962, drawing national attention. The prosecution had overwhelming evidence: Eleanor's detailed notebooks, the toxicology reports, testimony from Margaret Chen and her sons, statements from multiple witnesses describing Eleanor's pattern of isolation and control. The defense attorney, a court-appointed lawyer named Daniel Cross, had almost nothing to work with. Eleanor refused to cooperate with her own defense, sitting silently through most of the proceedings, occasionally making disturbing comments about how her victims had needed her, how she had helped them find peace. The psychiatric evaluation ordered by the court concluded that Eleanor was sane under legal definitions, fully capable of understanding that her actions were wrong and facing the consequences. But the psychiatrist noted something chilling in his report. Eleanor displayed a complete lack of empathy, viewing other people purely as objects to be manipulated for her benefit. She had convinced herself that killing these lonely, suffering people was actually a kindness, that she was ending their pain while also being compensated for her service. It was a twisted rationalization that allowed her to commit murder without guilt or remorse. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges: 2 counts of first-degree murder for Finch and Bridger, attempted murder for Margaret Chen, and multiple counts of fraud and forgery. The judge, a stern man named Emmett Walsh, sentenced Eleanor to death by hanging, the standard punishment in Washington state at the time for premeditated murder. But Eleanor would never face execution. While awaiting her appeal hearing in the county jail, she somehow obtained a quantity of pills, possibly smuggled in by an unknown visitor or stolen from the jail's medical supplies. She took them all at once, slipping into a coma before guards discovered her. She died 3 days later without regaining consciousness, robbing the state of the opportunity to execute her and robbing investigators of the chance to learn the full extent of her crimes. Detective Moore spent the next year trying to track down all of Eleanor's possible victims, traveling to small towns across the Pacific Northwest and California, interviewing local law enforcement, reviewing old death certificates and estate records. She eventually confirmed 9 definite murders, including the 2 she was convicted of, and another 6 probable cases where the evidence was strong but not quite definitive. That meant Eleanor Sutton had likely killed at least 15 people over the course of a decade, making her one of the most prolific serial killers in American history at that time, though few outside of law enforcement circles ever knew her name. Margaret Chen recovered, slowly regaining her mental clarity as the sedatives left her system. The damage to her reputation and business took longer to heal. The restaurant struggled for years before finally finding its footing again. Her sons both moved away for college and never returned to Forks, too traumatized by what had happened to their mother. Margaret herself became an advocate for elder abuse prevention, speaking publicly about manipulation tactics and warning signs, determined that something positive should come from her nightmare. The case led to significant changes in Washington state law regarding estate beneficiaries and caregiver oversight. New regulations require that anyone who inherited more than a certain amount from someone they had cared for would face automatic investigation to ensure the inheritance was legitimate and the deceased hadn't been unduly influenced or harmed. It was Eleanor's law, though it was never officially called that, designed to prevent anyone else from using caregiving as a cover for systematic murder and theft. The house Eleanor had purchased with Harold Finch's money stood empty for years, its dark windows staring out at Maple Street like dead eyes. Eventually, it was sold at auction and demolished, the lot remaining vacant to this day. Local kids tell stories about it being haunted, about seeing Eleanor's ghost walking through where the garden used to be, still looking for her next victim. It's nonsense, of course, but the story persists because it's easier to believe in ghosts than to accept the truth. The truth is that monsters are real, and they don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like Eleanor Vance, quiet and helpful and so very ordinary. They insert themselves into your life during your most vulnerable moments, offering assistance you desperately need, earning your trust so completely that you never see the danger until it's too late. They isolate you from everyone who might protect you, making themselves indispensable while simultaneously destroying you from the inside. And they do it all with a smile, with gentle words, with apparent selflessness that masks pure predatory calculation. That's the real horror of Eleanor Vance's story. Not that she killed 15 people, though that's horrifying enough, but that she did it by exploiting the fundamental human need for connection, for care, for someone to help when we're struggling. She weaponized kindness, turned compassion into a tool for murder. And in doing so, she reminded us that trust, that precious thing we must give to others to survive in society, can be the most dangerous thing of all when placed in the wrong hands. The forests around Forks still stand, dark and deep, their shadows stretching across the small town just as they did in 1962. The Olympic Mountains still loom on the horizon, ancient and indifferent to human suffering. And somewhere in those mountains, in the cemetery where Eleanor Sutton was buried in an unmarked grave, the earth holds secrets that will never be fully revealed. 15 confirmed victims, possibly more that were never discovered, lives ended by someone who convinced them she cared. If this story has affected you, if it's made you think about trust and vulnerability and the masks people wear, consider subscribing to see more deep dives into the darkest corners of true crime history. Leave a comment and sharing your thoughts. Have you ever known someone who seemed too helpful, too eager to insert themselves into vulnerable people's lives? Share this video with anyone who appreciates complex, unsettling true crime stories that challenge our assumptions about what monsters look like. Remember, the deadliest predators are often the ones we invite into our homes, the ones we trust completely, the ones who smile while they destroy us. Thank you for watching. Stay safe, and maybe, just maybe, be a little more careful about who you let into your life.